My, how far the mighty have fallen. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I am your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And what do I mean by that? I mean this headline from May of this year. Majority of Americans don't trust the FBI. Isn't that a beep shame, right? My, how the mighty have fallen. And before I get into all that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt. Where? At WashingtonTimes.com. Scroll to the bottom of the page, find the newsletter section, click on it, and look for Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. That is me. Click on it. Sign up for my 3 times a week newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Yes, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, right to your email box, containing all my commentaries that I write all day long at the Washington Times. I type my fingers to the bones so you guys can have the bullet points you need in your email box to fight the far left, right? But more than that, ding, ding, ding. It also contains my twice weekly Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast. You don't want to miss it because Bold and Blunt has the best guests in America. Yes, indeed. But guess what? You can also get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for your faith-based podcast, at B, Real Life Network, the news platform, the faith-based news platform of Pastor Jack Hibbs's church out in California, or C, anywhere podcasts are offered. That's right. It's so simple. You just have to go to a search engine, type in Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley, and guess what pops up? Bold and Blunt. Really quickly, you need to protect your IRA and 401k with gold now. That's right. Now. Call Republican Metals at 800-783-3118 to get your free gold guide. That's right. Free. Call 800-783-3118. All right, let's turn to this headline. So, a recent poll finds a majority of Americans don't trust the FBI. Wow, what a shocker. Guess what? The FBI, America's intel agencies, ought not to be trusted anyhow. Do you think founding fathers would ever have placed blind trust in agencies of government that largely worked under the cloak of secrecy, right? To them, that's a red flag. That's a clanging gong. That's a, hey now, heads up, transparency, accountability, that sort of thing. Founding fathers never would have trusted. They would have perhaps gone, as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, but they wouldn't have shown blind trust that if James Comey happens to scribble a memo in a White House office after having a quick conversation with the president, that memo would be irrefutable evidence of some sort of corruption on the part of the president. True fact. Do you remember that? Those people who pay attention to the news actually do remember that taking place, James Comey and his famous memo, and everybody in the media was going, oh, it's a memo. James Comey wrote it. We have to trust it. He wouldn't lie. And look where that led us. Russia collusion. Cha-ching, taxpayer dollars, investigation after investigation. But I digress. Back to this piece. A substantial majority of voters, the Americans that actually count when they have a say about political goings-ons, substantial majority of voters are concerned about, FBI interference in a future presidential election. Wow. Why? Why is that? With a similar number saying the agency needs wide-ranging reform. Gasp. What? According to a new poll, this piece goes on to write, by Harvard Caps/Harris, 70% of respondents said that they were either very or somewhat concerned about interference by the FBI and other intelligence agencies in elections. Wow, where did that come from? I wonder. Back to this piece. Further, 71% agreed that changes post-2016 had not done enough to prevent further interference, and that wide-ranging, and that phrase wide-ranging is in quotation marks, wide-ranging reform was still required. Well, this tells me, A, that Americans are awakening to the fact that, guess what? Donald Trump was right in pinpointing the need to take down the deep state. And B, that the deep state is not listening to what Americans say, because here we have Donald Trump running for the White House again, and officials at the federal level, officials at the state level, I mean, they're like greedy demons, lusting demons, just pining, questing, lusting to throw him behind bars, just in time for the next wave of GOP campaign rallies or campaign debates, right? They want Donald Trump in jail so badly. So that tells me that Americans are awakening to the fact that there is a problem with our intel agencies, but sadly, the intel agencies don't care that Americans know that there is a problem and that Americans have identified said intel agencies as the problem, because these same intel agencies are continuing to go after Donald Trump, to use their publicly tax-paid, publicly funded platforms and positions for political reasons. They're weaponized. They're political weapons of Joe Biden. Isn't that special? These results arrive, going back to this piece one more time, on the heels of the Durham report, which found that the FBI's justification for launching the Trump-Russia probe, known as Russiagate, in 2016 was, quote, seriously flawed, end quote. Well, I'll say, John Durham, who led the investigation, wrote that the FBI relied on, quote, raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence, end quote, when it applied for electronic surveillance search warrants against Trump campaign aides. Remember when Trump famously said his campaign was being spied on and he was laughed at, mocked at, called a conspiracy theorist, and anybody who followed along and gave Donald Trump a speaking platform to say such things was automatically branded the same sort of conspiracy theorist as Donald Trump. And look who turned out to be true. I would add to that, though, that it wasn't just raw, unanalyzed, and uncorroborated intelligence. It was DNC pushed intelligence, right? It was Hillary Clinton fawning friends pushed intelligence. So that's all to say, in a long-winded way, that America's intelligence agencies, totally untrustworthy. And I have with me a guest today who has some explosive insights. Doesn't that make him a great, bold, and blunt guest, right? He's got explosive insights about the weaponization of the federal government against the federal government's political enemies. His name is Tom Baker. He is a retired FBI special agent who just testified, who gave some very interesting, dare I say, explosive information on Capitol Hill in February before the U.S. House Committee on the Judiciary Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. That's a mouthful, right? But it was before Congress he testified. And he happens to be the author of this book that I haven't read yet, but honestly, I can't wait to get my hands on it. The Fall of the FBI, how a once great agency became a threat to democracy. And that goes back to my opening statement, my, how the mighty have fallen. Tom, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is so great to have you here.
Great to be with you.
So I was looking at your testimony on Capitol Hill in February and reading through some of the things you wrote and looking at the polls in America about trust in the FBI. And you have the perfect book that you wrote, The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Talk to me a little bit about what happened to the FBI.
Well, I think a lot of the problems that have come to the surface in the last, 3 or 4 years now can trace back to a cultural change that was begun under Bob Mueller when he was FBI director. That's Bob Mueller of special counsel fame, and then was exacerbated by the poor leadership of James Comey.
So the cultural change that you talk about is sort of a mindset shift in how FBI agents are conditioned to do their job. It's very interesting how you detail that. What exactly happens?
Well, Cheryl, you're absolutely right. A mindset shift. That's a very good way of putting it. The FBI had always had a counterintelligence mission, and of course we're always concerned about preventing and investigating terrorist acts. But the shift from the mindset of a law enforcement agency to that of an intelligence agency, which I think is at the root of all these recent problems, traces back to the September 11th attacks. Bob Mueller became the FBI director just a couple of days before the September 11th attacks, which happened on a Tuesday. The following Saturday morning, he was summoned to the president's retreat in Camp David, Maryland. He thought to give a report on the FBI's investigation to that point. And what the FBI had done in those really only about 3.5 days before the Tuesday attack and that Saturday morning was what they do best: investigate. And in that short window of time, they had identified all 19 hijackers, their associations, their financing, their past travel, and their connections going back to Al-Qaeda. And when he was done making that report, Bob Mueller expected, and he's told us this several times, praise and thanks, and instead President George W. Bush simply said, "I don't care about that. I just want to know how you're going to prevent the next one." Mueller told us he left that meeting bound and determined to change the culture from that of a law enforcement agency to an intelligence-driven agency. And that had a lot of unintended and ultimately bad consequences.
Because law enforcement deals with responding to what's already taken place and investigating what's already taken place. Intelligence tries to get ahead of the problem, right? Is that primarily the main difference in layman's?
Well, that is a difference. Yes, I would suggest that in a law enforcement agency, your mindset, consciously or unconsciously, you're working forward every day towards the day when you're going to have to stand up in court before a judge or before a jury and raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, to a set of facts. Now, in an intelligence agency, they don't deal in that kind of focused end. They deal in estimates and best guesses. And they call it an intelligence estimate. And their tool in doing that, getting to that point, is not swearing to tell the truth, but actually using every day deceit and deception. So it creates an entirely different mindset.
That is a fascinating insight, and that explains so much, because the trickle-down effect, I'm sure, and maybe you can speak to this as well, because your area of expertise is law enforcement. The trickle-down effect to local community policing would have that same sort of intelligence mindset, right, instead of law enforcement.
Yes, and what happens in the law enforcement mindset, and when people are appropriately trained, formed in their role in our society, really in any Western democracy, but certainly in the United States, you're going to deal within the framework of the Constitution. You're going to have guardrails on your work, on your areas of endeavor. Whereas an intelligence agency, they don't deal within those guide rails. They don't have a framework. They don't, in a sense, they don't have boundaries. So then you have freewheeling intelligence analysts, and we just saw a terrible example of this in the FBI over the past several months that's come to light, where they can just speculate on things and they come up with this there's no other way to describe it, crackpot idea of investigating, of surveilling Catholics, in this case,
yes,
who prefer worship using Latin. In a law enforcement agency, you'd never come up with that idea because you'd only be looking at people who advocate or actually commit violence. You wouldn't get, and on our Constitution, First Amendment, you wouldn't get into people's speech, and you certainly wouldn't get into their religion, so long as they didn't advocate violence. And there's no indication that these traditional Catholics advocate violence.
Wow, that is really insightful, and I really can't wait to read The Fall of the FBI now, because just what you spell out, you can see this taking place. And just to expand it a little bit and show where it really gets frightening, add to that mindset shift, right? Not just with the feds, but at the local levels of policing. Add to that the militarization of police with the equipment that they get directly from the military, along with new technology that allows them to make best guess policing guess. This becomes really frightening for Americans concerned about the Constitution, yes?
Yes, and some of that same militarization, of course, is another thing that's been manifest in the FBI. It may or may not have the same root, but it's been manifest recently, and a lot of former agents like myself, and even some people currently in the FBI, tell us they're very concerned about this. And one fellow, Hal Rogers, who was an FBI agent for 10 or 12 years and then a member of Congress, he recently took to the airwaves, and he like me, loves the FBI, but he took to the airwaves and he said, this just looks terrible. Every time you see an arrest on television, often of a nonviolent criminal, the FBI is rolling up in military gear with helmets and long guns of various descriptions. It's so unnecessary, and we saw it very graphically in the arrest of some pro-life demonstrators,
yep,
and in the arrest of white-collar criminals. In past decades, and I realize anytime you make an arrest, there's always the potential for danger, because humans, you just don't know how they'll react to that. But with white-collar criminals and nonviolent criminals in the past, there never was this militarized approach to their arrests, their apprehension. And in fact, and this might shock some people, even in the FBI, sometimes when it was a white-collar criminal that had been investigated over a period of time, and if we knew they were represented by an attorney, the agent in charge of the case would call up the attorney and ask him to have his client come to the office and give himself up at a certain time.
Right.
That was not at all unusual. This sending out at the crack of dawn, effectively SWAT teams or HRT teams with long guns to arrest U.S. citizens is not a good look. And that's what Hal Rogers, the former congressman, tried to tell the Bureau executives recently. It's not a good look.
And you know, it also has the probably unintended effect of fueling the arguments of the anti-police movement. The Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes and the Black Lives Matter and Antifa types that want to defund the police. All they have to do is point to some of this vivid imagery that we see on television and say, see, police need to be controlled.
Yes, and when I was still in the FBI, I mean, we did, and we used, and I was an advocate actually of the agents every day when they're going out on their routine business to wear their, and they have it now in Velcro. It's very concealable under a woman's blouse or a man's shirt, body armor. I've always been an advocate of that. But to take what we call soft clothes, a soft approach to go up to people and not approach people with rain jackets on or helmets, and it's a different issue maybe than it's part and parcel of the change in culture.
Yes,
but it's a slightly different issue, Cheryl, that you're raising.
Yep, it all goes toward the same, but it's not exactly specific to what we started talking about, which I want to circle back to about Bob Mueller. In your testimony to Congress and how you described how he enacted changes at the FBI and how investigations go forward, it almost makes him seem like a sympathetic character, because here he is just going to talk to the commander-in-chief, the White House, the president, about what his agency is going to do or what his agency did, and he gets what sounded like belittled, and he gets put in this rock and a hard place. Am I wrong in saying that he should be seen as sympathetic? Is he a bad guy? How do you view Mueller?
Well, I don't view Mueller as a bad guy. I think what he set out to do had bad consequences, very bad consequences, and he was, which is not, a lot of people in that position you could say this about. He was a bit of an egotist. He had a big pride. Okay, I could say that, and he wanted. His management style was extraordinarily hands-on, so Mueller's was, so he drew everything in. And one of the things immediately after September 11th that factually happened, he wanted that investigation run out of headquarters. And that went contrary to 75 years of bureau operations, where traditionally in the FBI, investigations are run out of a field office. Each case, no matter how big or small, there's a case agent assigned to that case. He's supervised by a field supervisor in that office. Ultimately, there's an agent in charge of that office, the special agent in charge, and only later is it looked at by headquarters. And this system of running things from the field had worked very well, provides levels of review, and has people on the ground who are very familiar with the matters at hand. Mueller wanted that change. He wanted it all pulled into FBI headquarters, and that's what he did. And a lot of the executives at the time tried to tell him that's not the way to do it. So he set up what was called a headquarters special, eliminating layers of independent judgment and review out there in the field. Now, the September 11th attacks, so the investigation of the September 11th attacks, which the FBI codenamed Pent Bomb, was the first investigation run in that fashion. Later, James Comey exacerbated all these problems when he ran the Hillary Clinton investigation and then the Russian collusion investigation. That is to say, the investigation of the Trump campaign, which the FBI codenamed Crossfire Hurricane.
Yes.
He ran those investigations totally out of headquarters. That had disastrous repercussions, because what you didn't have these layers of independent judgment or review. So in the Russian collusion investigation, and this is very well documented, and it was documented again, it's in my book, but it was also then validated by the Durham report. You had a guy in FBI headquarters, a deputy assistant director, Peter Strzok, initiating that investigation, writing the communication that authorized the investigation, signing that communication out on a Sunday, and then on the following Monday, the next day, getting on a plane, going to London, and conducting the first interview in that investigation. No independent judgment, no levels of review. It was bound to end badly, and it did.
Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, they got booted, right? James Comey is no longer a factor. But is there any real accountability for these bad players?
Well, okay, you just raised a very good point again, Cheryl. Yes, and the Russian collusion thing, the main malefactors, Comey, Strzok, McCabe, they're all out the door. Later in so many other instances over the past 2 or 3 years, the bad guys, really, the poor performers, or the people who got the FBI, I'll still say, in trouble, they've been put out the door. You saw it in the Governor Whitmer case. 2 of the agents deeply involved in that were both fired. You saw it in the gymnast case. 2 of the agents deeply involved in that were let go. So each time this happens, here's what happens. Chris Wray and others sit down before Congress and before a press conference and tell people effectively these bad apples are gone. Nothing to see here now. And they're just not recognizing that all of this is caused by the underlying cultural problem.
Right.
Now, who recognized that was Durham in his report. He said the FBI needs to be reminded constantly of this. Chris Wray and officially the Bureau issued a statement in response to the Durham report, and they said these people are no longer with us, period.
You know, I got to wonder, and I know our time is tight here, so I'll just make this the last question, but I got to wonder, as many listeners probably are right now, is there any hope for the FBI? Is there a chance to actually reform the FBI so it works on behalf of the people once again, given what you just said? It's a cultural change. It's a mindset shift that's occurred. It's not just a couple of bad apples.
Cheryl, there's only hope if the culture is changed. And to change the culture, the first thing one has to do is recognize the problem. There are, as regards corporate culture, there are textbooks written about this, and they all say that you have to recognize the problem. As long as Chris Wray and others are unwilling to recognize the problem, we won't have the cultural change. Once they recognize the problem, we can make the changes, we can emphasize the right things, we can change the mission statement, but that's what has to happen. The culture has to change. And if it changes, yes, I think there's hope to restore the FBI to its place of great respect that it had for so many decades in this country.
Well, that's an honest answer, and I really appreciate that. And I got to say, the more I listen to you speak, the more important that your book seems for all Americans to read. The Fall of the FBI, How a Once Great Agency Became a Threat to Democracy. Tom Baker, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you for all the good you do.
Thank you. And speaking of good work, if you're a conservative and you are retired, Republican Metals believes you need to protect that savings now. Currency change is coming now. Call Republican Metals at 800-783-3118. That's 800-783-3118. More good work there. I want to thank you for listening to Bold and Blunt. If you like Bold and Blunt, you may get it at WashingtonTimes.com, Edify.app, Real Life Network, or anywhere podcasts are offered. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.